In the winter haze of 1977, inside a dim apartment on Lower Manhattan's Bowery, Debbie Harry stood before a cracked mirror, her platinum hair glowing like a beacon in the half-dark. Outside, New York throbbed with punk chaos and neon desire, but inside, the woman the world worshipped carried a silence heavier than fame itself. Debbie Harry, the radiant face of Blondie, looked untouchable under the stage lights, yet every spotlight only sharpened the shadows she tried to outrun. Behind the smoky clubs and glittered runways were the ghosts of an abandoned childhood, the pressure of a rising empire, and the dangerous escapes she whispered into the night. And somewhere between the applause and the void, a single moment of betrayal would send her life spiraling toward a truth she could no longer hide. This is the untold truth of Debbie Harry. Welcome to Hollywood Mysteries. Long before the leather jackets, the CBGB lights, or the platinum hair that would become a cultural weapon, Debbie Harry's story began with a silence no one around her could hear. It was the kind of silence that settles into a child's bones before she can speak the silence of being given away. Born Angela Trimble in Miami, she was placed for adoption at just 3 months old, a decision that would mark her spirit long before she understood what abandonment meant. The couple who raised her, Richard and Catherine Harry, loved her in the pragmatic way of post-war America. Provide, protect, discipline. But something essential was missing, a sense of emotional gravity, the intangible warmth that tells a child she belongs to the world. Debbie grew up sensing that the ground under her feet was never completely solid. She later described it not as a memory, but as an atmosphere, a physical cloud left behind when she was separated from her birth mother. That metaphor wasn't poetic exaggeration. It was the closest she could come to explaining an ache that never went away. It was the feeling of being the last page torn from a book. You know you came from somewhere, you just don't know what story you were taken out of. In suburban New Jersey, she played the role expected of a polite, imaginative girl. She smiled when adults asked her what she wanted to be. She sat still in classrooms even when her thoughts roamed like animals trying to escape. But when she looked in the mirror, she sensed duality. Angela, the child who didn't have a beginning, and Debbie, the girl she was trying to grow into. It was a split that would shape everything: her art, her voice, her hunger for reinvention. Her adoptive mother, Catherine, was strict, controlled, and demanding in ways Debbie struggled to decipher. Not cruel, but unnervingly distant. The kind of woman who believed a child's emotions should be folded neatly like freshly washed laundry. Debbie learned young that vulnerability wasn't a language spoken in her home. Love was expressed through chores completed, not secrets shared. So she kept her interior world sealed shut. She became an expert at quiet compliance, while her imagination roared inside her skull. Even as a teenager, the sense of displacement sharpened. She dreamed of a life far away from tidy lawns and rule-following neighbors. She sang in her room, not because she wanted applause, but because her voice felt like proof she existed. Someone abandoned at birth often learns to create her own echo, a sound that confirms she is real. For Debbie, music became that echo. The search for her biological mother haunted her for years. When she finally located the woman, a pianist, wrapped in her own complicated life, the meeting was not salvation. It was a second fracture. Her birth mother refused a relationship. No dramatic speech, no tearful reunion, just a wall. Solid, blank, final. It was rejection, but in a colder, more elegant form. Rejection delivered without anger, just disinterest. This wound was sharper than the first. Being given away as an infant could be forgiven as circumstance. Being rejected as an adult felt like confirmation. The place she had always hoped existed for her simply did not. And yet, Debbie did what wounded children often do. She moved forward, as if nothing had happened. She wrapped the pain in humor, in irony, in the effortless cool that people would later mistake for confidence. But the truth was simpler and more tragic. She carried a lifelong ache to belong to something, someone, somewhere. That ache would determine the kind of men she trusted, the risks she took, the addictions she flirted with, and the stage persona she built like armor. When she stepped into New York City in the late 60 seconds, she wasn't just chasing art. She was chasing identity. New York rewarded the broken, the misfit, the reinvented, and Debbie fit all three categories. The city gave her exactly what she had been deprived of, a space to create herself from scratch. But cities don't heal wounds, they magnify them. In clubs filled with smoke and beautiful strangers, Debbie discovered the seductive power of becoming someone else, the persona who sings without fear, who glows under neon, who doesn't need anyone's approval to exist. But even in her wildest nights, the child inside her, the one left behind twice, lingered like a shadow just behind the spotlight. Fame would later transform that shadow into something darker, heavier, something she would spend decades trying to outrun. By the mid-1970 seconds, New York was a city cracked open at the seams, bankrupt, violent, and shaking with the electricity of a counterculture rising from its ruins. Debbie Harry arrived inside that chaos, not as a queen, but as a quiet observer. She took jobs that paid little but allowed her to watch people. Receptionist, waitress, even a stint as a Playboy bunny. Each role sharpened her understanding of performance, how people hide their pain in costume, how identity is a kind of choreography. She absorbed everything like a camera in human form. Then came Chris Stein, the dark-eyed guitarist, whose presence felt like an unfinished sentence she wanted to complete. Their bond wasn't the explosive kind. It was quieter, stranger, built on shared alienation and an instinctive artistic synchrony. Together, they formed Blondie, not as a band chasing stardom, but as a pair of outsiders, carving out a language of their own. CBGB became their temple. Inside that dirty maze of sweat, graffiti, and cigarette haze, Debbie found a stage that matched her internal chaos. She wasn't trying to be glamorous. She didn't plan to become an icon. Yet the moment she stepped into the spotlight, the room rearranged itself around her. She had a presence that didn't demand attention. It magnetized it. The contrast between her icy beauty and Punk's raw edges created something entirely new. She was simultaneously a character and a real woman, a mystery wrapped in a smirk. Fame didn't arrive in a thunderclap. It seeped in like rising water. First came the crowds, then the magazine photo shoots, then the tours. Blondie wasn't just another New York band. They became the pulse of a cultural shift. Songs like Heart of Glass and Call Me vaulted them from underground darlings to global sensations. Debbie became the face of a movement, a visual symbol that critics and fans tried to decode. But a sense have shadows, and at the peak of her power, Debbie realized the world didn't see her. They saw a projection, a blonde bombshell, a punk goddess, a cool, untouchable muse. The persona grew faster than the woman behind it. Photographers demanded she play the seductress. Journalists dismissed her intellect with casual sexism. Executives insisted on shaping her image into something profitable. Debbie complied just enough to survive, never fully surrendering, but rarely allowed to resist. Her body became a battleground between authenticity and expectation. The industry loved her, but only the version it could sell. In interviews, she often smiled through comments that would have enraged anyone else. Men asked her if she was really in control or just the pretty face. They treated Blondie as though it revolved around her sexuality rather than her artistry. She learned to use humor as a shield, irony as a weapon. But behind closed doors, the pressure carved into her spirit like tiny unhealed cuts. At the same time, success demanded sacrifices she wasn't prepared for. The schedule was relentless. Recording, touring, press, rehearsals, meetings, photo sessions. Days blurred into nights, and nights into exhaustion. Debbie wasn't sleeping. wasn't eating enough, and wasn't tending to the loneliness that fame amplifies rather than soothes. On stage, she glowed. Off stage, she was slowly drifting from herself. Chris Stein, her creative partner and intimate companion, became her anchor and her burden. Their connection was deep, almost psychic, but it placed her in a role she didn't know how to carry. She wasn't just a girlfriend or bandmate. She became his emotional stabilizer, the person who absorbed his storms and translated them into something they could both survive. Their love was real, but it was built on fragile foundations: shared trauma, artistic obsession, and a codependent tenderness. As Blondie's success expanded, so did the cracks in their world. The team around them mishandled finances, a swarm of accountants, managers, and advisors who operated with more ambition than integrity. Debbie didn't fully grasp how bad things were until the band was staring at debts that felt impossible to climb out of. It wasn't a single catastrophic moment. It was an accumulation of bad decisions, overlooked details, and trust placed in the wrong hands. But the greatest sacrifice came from Debbie herself, the dream she never got to live. She had been offered the role of Pris in Blade Runner, a role that could have reshaped her entire artistic trajectory. Yet the band's schedule, the demands of their label, and the suffocating expectations of the industry robbed her of the chance. She later said she regretted listening to those who told her it wasn't the right move. For someone who built her life on reinvention, losing that opportunity was more than a professional disappointment, it was a symbolic wound. As the world worshipped her, Debbie slipped deeper into a quiet despair masked by cool detachment. She began relying on drugs not to party, but to negotiate the emotional noise inside her chest. Heroin was an escape hatch, a momentary softening of edges that had become too sharp. For a woman who felt abandoned twice by her birth mother and by the version of the world she once believed in, addiction felt almost like a familiar companion. The irony of Debbie Harry's ascent was that the higher she climbed, the less of herself she was allowed to bring. Fans adored her image, critics dissected her persona, the industry packaged her like a product. She became an icon at the expense of becoming a person. Yet through it all, her artistry remained pure. Debbie wasn't performing to be liked, she was performing to survive. Every note she sang was stitched with longing, anger, desire, rebellion. She created beauty out of the very wounds that threatened to destroy her. By the time Blondie reached the top of global charts, Debbie Harry had given the world everything it asked for and sacrificed parts of herself she would never fully recover. It was the price of becoming larger than life, losing pieces of the life that was hers alone. There is a kind of love that feels like a rescue, and for years, that was what Chris Stein represented to Debbie Harry, a refuge from a world that treated her like an ornament or a product. Their bond began with a shared sense of otherness, two people who felt misplaced in the world but perfectly in tune with each other. Debbie wasn't the sort who believed in dramatic declarations. Her heart was cautious. But with Chris, she sensed a rare familiarity, as if they had been invented from the same quiet sadness. Their apartment was small, cluttered, and often dark. The sort of place where the blinds were always half closed, not to hide anything, but because the outside world felt too loud. Debbie cooked meals, scribbled lyrics, and tried to impose some structure on a life defined by late-night gigs and unpredictable days. Chris was affectionate, gentle in ways the industry wasn't, and deeply connected to her creativity. But beneath the tenderness lived a fragility neither of them fully understood. Their love deepened as Blondie exploded into the global spotlight. But with fame came pressure, and with pressure came cracks that widened faster than either could repair. Debbie had spent her life carrying people, parents who were emotionally distant, managers who mishandled their finances, journalists who dismissed her artistry, but loving Chris required a different kind of weight. It wasn't that he demanded it, it was that she offered it instinctively. She had always been the girl who tried to hold broken things together. Then the symptoms began. It started with fatigue that didn't make sense. then strange lesions, then pain that moved unpredictably across his body. Chris, once vibrant, suddenly appeared ghost-like under the apartment's dim lights. The doctors were puzzled, and their search for answers turned into a revolving door of specialists, tests, and confusion. Debbie watched him deteriorate in real time, a helpless witness to a man slowly disappearing behind his own skin. When the diagnosis finally arrived, pemphigus vulgaris, a rare autoimmune disease, it gave no comfort. The treatment was brutal: high-dose steroids, risky medications, endless hospital monitoring. Debbie stepped away from touring, from opportunities, from the momentum Blondie had built. She sat beside Chris for hours, adjusting blankets, feeding him, negotiating with nurses, and reading aloud to keep him awake. She became the caretaker, nurse, emotional anchor, financial shield, everything except the artist she once recognized. This was the turning point where love stopped being a sanctuary and became a battlefield. Hospitals have a way of stripping illusions away. Debbie spent so much time there she memorized the patterns on the linoleum floors. She learned the rhythm of machines, the temperature of sterile air, the looks nurses give when they're bracing for bad news. Fame didn't matter. Stage lights meant nothing. She was just another woman holding a man's hand while doctors tried to keep him alive. The world outside didn't pause for her. Bills mounted, Blondie fractured. The people responsible for their finances disappeared when accountability arrived. Debbie wasn't just losing her partner to illness. She was losing her livelihood, her future, the empire she had helped build from the bones of downtown New York. It felt like being robbed in slow motion. During one hospital stay, Chris became so frail he could barely speak. Debbie later recalled moments where she feared he might not survive the night. She would sit by the window, staring at the distant city lights, wondering how life could twist so suddenly from euphoria to devastation. She had always known love could hurt, but she hadn't expected it to demand everything. And as Chris weakened physically, Debbie weakened emotionally. But the world didn't see this. They saw the cool, immortal Debbie Harry on magazine covers, the effortless beauty, the icy stare, the voice that seduced radio stations across continents. No one saw the woman skipping meals, sleeping in chairs, brushing his hair to keep him comfortable, or crying silently in the hospital bathroom because she didn't want him to see her break. Their relationship, once tender and artistic, became defined by survival. Debbie wasn't just his partner, she was the only barrier between him and oblivion. Even when she performed, she carried the fear of losing him like a stone in her chest. Some nights, she rushed off stage, terrified she'd return to a voicemail reporting the worst. Illness changes people, not just the patient, and for Debbie, it created a quiet kind of desperation. She had already lived a life shaped by abandonment, and now she was watching the person she loved most slip away. For a woman whose deepest wound was being left behind, this was the cruelest echo. As Chris battled for his life, Debbie turned to the only escape she had ever found: the blur of drugs. Not to party, not to impress anyone, but to numb the edges of a reality too sharp to face head-on. She once admitted that substances felt like a pressure valve, a way to endure the emotional roller coaster. The world may have seen a glamorous star indulging in the excesses of rock fame, but the truth was simpler and sadder. She was self-medicating heartbreak. Love and fear twisted together until the lines blurred. Debbie loved Chris with a devotion that bordered on self-erasure. She gave up roles, opportunities, even her momentum as an icon. And perhaps the most painful truth was that she did it without resentment. Loyalty had always been her default setting, even when it demanded sacrifice she couldn't afford. When Chris eventually stabilized, their relationship didn't snap back into place. Trauma had altered its shape. The bond remained profound, but the romantic flame dimmed under the weight of years spent in survival mode. They drifted, gently, but inevitably, into a new dynamic, still connected, still loyal, but changed in ways neither were willing to name aloud. The public never saw this chapter clearly. They saw the headlines, the band tensions, the hiatus, the financial collapse. But they didn't see the real climax of Debbie Harry's love story. A woman who poured every fragment of herself into saving someone she adored, only to lose parts of herself in the process. It was the kind of tragedy Hollywood rarely writes. Not a betrayal screamed in living rooms, not a dramatic divorce, but a slow erosion, an unraveling born from illness, sacrifice, and the silent agony of watching love turn into a responsibility too heavy for one person to carry. Debbie Harry survived. Chris survived. But their love, in its original form, did not. And that loss, quiet, noble, devastating, became one of the defining shadows of her life. Success doesn't collapse in a single night. It unravels slowly, thread by thread, until one day the person living inside the fame realizes they are standing in ruins. For Debbie Harry, the downfall began quietly, not with a scandal, not with a public breakdown, but with an accumulation of invisible blows. Chris's illness, the financial catastrophe, the band's internal fractures, the exhaustion of keeping her persona intact. Every crisis that struck Blondie hit Debbie twice, once as the lead singer and once as the emotional core of the group. When Blondie disbanded in the early 1980 seconds, the world assumed it was a natural fade-out, the typical trajectory of a band that had run its course. What they didn't know was that Debbie was drowning. She wasn't just coping with the collapse of a career. She was trying to survive the collapse of a life. The debts left behind by mismanagement were staggering, the kind that swallow entire futures. It was the cruel irony of the industry. The band had been global superstars, but on paper, they were financially gutted. Everything they had, built albums, tours, branding, had been undermined by people they trusted. But the deeper collapse happened in Debbie's body and mind. Years of stress had worn her down. Constant touring, sleepless nights, drug use, and caretaking had pushed her into a state where her health was finally screaming for attention. The adrenaline that once kept her performing through chaos no longer worked. She felt heavy, slow, and adrift. The high-voltage woman who once commanded stages now found it difficult to navigate the simplest routines. Her confidence, that cool, untouchable aura, faltered in private. She wondered if she had anything left to give. And in the darkest corners of those years, there were moments she avoided speaking about for decades. The gnawing anxiety, the emotional numbness that followed Chris's near death, and the chilling memory of the assault she had survived back in her early years. The knife, the threat, the feeling of being reduced to an object at the mercy of someone else's violence. Trauma doesn't disappear simply because life moves on. It waits, then resurfaces when the walls are thinnest, and Debbie's walls were paper thin by then. Around this time, she slipped further into a dependency she rarely glamorized. Her relationship with drugs wasn't the cartoonish rock star stereotype the tabloids liked to paint. It was quieter, sadder, a way to blur the edges of pain when life felt too sharp to handle. Heroin, cocaine, even fentanyl in brief, dangerous chapters, they weren't adventures. They were self-prescribed anesthesia. She used just enough to soften the fear, enough to mute the loneliness, enough to keep functioning through days she described as emotionally brutal. Yet Debbie never spiraled into the public spectacle of addiction. There were no notorious overdose incidents, no ambulances arriving at night, no tabloid photos of her stumbling out of clubs. Her self-destruction was private, internal, and meticulously hidden. She understood the danger of letting the industry see her broken. They would have tossed her aside without hesitation. As Chris slowly stabilized from his illness, Debbie realized her own deterioration was now the problem. Their roles had reversed. The woman who once held him upright was now crumbling under the weight of the years she spent trying to save him, and the guilt of that realization broke her in ways nothing else had. She blamed herself for the career detours, for the emotional toll, for the debts, for the lost opportunities. But what hurt most, though she rarely admitted it, was how their relationship had quietly shifted. Love had transformed into obligation, then into history. They still cared for each other deeply, but the fire that once defined them had dimmed into a warm but distant glow. By the late 1980 seconds, Debbie Harry was a ghost in an industry she once dominated. The public assumed she had faded out by choice, or that aging had simply pushed her out of the spotlight, the cruel destiny of many female artists. The truth was far more complicated and far more painful. She hadn't disappeared. She had been swallowed. And then came the reckoning. Debbie eventually confronted her addictions, not through dramatic confessions or televised rehab specials, but through a quiet, stubborn refusal to let herself become another tragic rock casualty. She had survived 2 abandonments, the brutality of a violent crime, the pressure of global fame, a partner's near death, and the collapse of a musical empire. She wasn't going to let substances finish the job. Sobriety didn't arrive all at once. It came in phases, in slow awakenings, in relapses that taught her humility, and in final choices made not out of fear, but out of a desire to reclaim the life she almost lost. She described it not as triumph, but as maintenance, a steady, unglamorous rebuilding of a self that had been shattered over decades. But even as sobriety took root, a larger truth emerged. Debbie Harry had spent her whole life fighting battles no one ever saw. And in the quiet aftermath of fame, she finally allowed herself to acknowledge what she had survived. Her childhood abandonment had left her with a lifelong sense of impermanence. Her assault had carved a hidden wound she carried like a shadow. Her role as Chris's caretaker had drained her emotionally and creatively. Her addictions had nearly erased her. And the machinery of the music industry had commodified, exploited, and discarded her in equal measure. Yet she outlived it all. When Blondie reunited in the late 1990 seconds, it wasn't nostalgia, it was resurrection. Debbie stepped back into the spotlight not as the punk goddess of the CBGB era, but as a woman who had walked through fire and returned with scars she no longer felt obligated to hide. Her voice was different, older, deeper, fuller. Her presence was more grounded, more human, less ethereal. She no longer sought approval. She performed because she wanted to, not because she needed to. And as the world rediscovered her, a new narrative emerged. Debbie Harry wasn't simply a survivor. She was living proof that fame is not the defining measure of a life. What defines a person, what defined Debbie, is the ability to rebuild even when the world expects you to disappear. In her later interviews, Debbie spoke with a calmness that came from knowing she had outrun every ghost. The mother who rejected her twice, the men who harmed her, the industry that tried to own her, the drugs that tried to claim her, and the grief that nearly consumed her. She admitted that some wounds never fully heal, but she also said something else, something that felt like the truest conclusion to her story. I'm still here, steady, unbroken, defiant. Debbie Harry's downfall wasn't a collapse. It was a crucible. And the truth, the one buried beneath decades of glamour and tragedy, is that she became stronger in the ruins than she ever was in the spotlight. Her legacy isn't her beauty, or her fame, or even the hits that changed music culture. Her legacy is survival. Survival against a world that tried again and again to erase her. And she refused to disappear.